The soft chime of the bell above the door barely registered against the quiet hum of a small grocery store. The air smelled of slightly overripe fruit and the faint spice of old wooden shelves. Fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the modest interior, where aisles stood packed tightly with shelves that leaned just a little under their weight. The store wasn't anything remarkable, just another neighborhood market, the kind that saw regular customers but rarely, if ever, anyone important. Keanu Reeves stepped inside without ceremony, moving with the quiet ease of someone accustomed to being unnoticed. His clothes were simple, an old flannel shirt layered over a dark t-shirt, jeans that had seen years of wear, and a pair of scuffed boots that spoke of long walks rather than red carpets. His hair, slightly disheveled, fell past his shoulders, framing a face marked by time but never arrogance. He carried himself with a peace that was rare in people, a presence that, while unassuming, had a way of shifting the air around him. At the counter stood a woman, her frame small, her shoulders drawn inward as if the world had pressed down on her too many times to count. Her clothes, washed out, too thin for the season, hung loosely on her, as if she had learned long ago that dignity was more valuable than comfort. A faded scarf was wrapped around her hair, fraying at the edges, while her hands, rough from labor and time, gripped the strap of her canvas bag as though it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. The items on the counter weren't many: a loaf of bread, a small bag of rice, a few bruised apples, and a can of soup. Not luxury, not indulgence, just the barest essentials, chosen with care, counted down to the last cent. Her fingers hesitated over the zipper of her worn purse, moving with the hesitant tremble of someone running the numbers in their head one last time, praying that the total wouldn't betray them. Behind the counter, the store clerk, a young man with a neatly pressed uniform and a name tag that sat just a little too proudly on his chest, watched her with poorly veiled impatience. He leaned against the register, one hand drumming idly on the countertop, his posture relaxed in the way of someone who believed himself untouchable. His lips curled into something that barely qualified as a smile, an expression more amused than kind. A scoff, just loud enough to be heard, slipped from his mouth as he cast a glance at her tattered coat, his eyes flicking over the frayed sleeves, the patched elbows, the way her fingers hovered too long over the few bills she had pulled from her wallet. There was no kindness in his gaze, no patience in his tone as he muttered something under his breath, just a few words, sharp and dismissive, the kind of remark that wasn't meant to be loud enough to demand a response but loud enough to sting. A cruel joke about where people like her should shop, a comment wrapped in mockery, delivered with the casual ease of someone who thought their words carried no weight. The woman stiffened, her fingers tightening over the crumpled bills in her palm. Her eyes dropped, shame flickering over her features in a way that was practiced, as if this wasn't the first time, wasn't even the 100th time, she had been spoken to this way. She didn't argue, didn't meet his gaze, didn't demand the dignity she deserved. Instead, she only nodded slightly, as if she had expected it, as if she had long accepted that people like her were always met with the same unspoken rule: be small, be silent, be invisible. She fumbled through the few coins in her palm, lips pressed into a thin line as she tried, desperately, to piece together enough for what little she had taken. A few steps behind her, standing in line, Keanu Reeves watched. His expression remained unreadable, his dark eyes calm yet observant, taking in the moment with the quiet patience of someone who had seen more of the world than most. He didn't shift, didn't sigh, didn't move to make his presence known. He simply watched the way the woman swallowed hard against the lump in her throat, watched the way her fingers trembled slightly as she counted out her change, watched the way the clerk barely concealed his boredom, rolling his eyes before tapping his fingers against the counter again. The store itself seemed indifferent to the exchange, the shelves standing silent, the distant hum of the refrigerator units the only other sound in the quiet. Other customers in the store paid little mind, their attention fixed on price tags and expiration dates, unwilling or unwillingly conditioned to look away from discomfort. But Keanu saw. And he wasn't the type to ignore what mattered. The woman's fingers trembled as she sifted through the small collection of coins in her palm, her lips moving slightly, almost silently, as she counted and recounted. The soft clinking of metal against metal was the only sound she made, but it seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the store. The numbers didn't add up. She knew it before she even finished counting, but still, she hoped. The store clerk, watching her with increasing impatience, exhaled a long, exaggerated sigh. He drummed his fingers against the countertop, each tap deliberate, a rhythmic signal of his mounting annoyance. The plastic name tag pinned to his chest caught the fluorescent light, gleaming as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his entire posture radiating disinterest. He wasn't making any effort to hide his disdain. A few feet away, a woman flipping through a tabloid magazine barely glanced up. An older man at the back of the line shifted his cart slightly, angling himself as if to distance himself from the scene. Another customer, a young guy scrolling through his phone, smirked, barely suppressing a chuckle. No one said anything. No one intervened. The clerk let out another sigh, louder this time, meant to be heard, meant to make a point. His expression was the perfect picture of mockery, half amused, half irritated. The way he looked at the woman was not with sympathy, not even with pity, but with something much colder. He muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, just loud enough for the words to land where they would hurt the most. A comment wrapped in cruelty, laced with condescension. A remark about how long she was taking, how people like her always slowed things down, always wasted time. The words hit her like a stone. Her hands stilled, fingers curling slightly over the few coins she held. She didn't look up. She didn't defend herself. She had no defense to give. The moment stretched, unbearable in its weight, and for the first time, she seemed on the verge of breaking. And then, the air in the store shifted. A voice, calm yet unmistakably firm, cut through the tension, breaking the spell of silence and indifference. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it was impossible to ignore. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle but undeniable. A quiet strength had entered the space, like the stillness before a storm, a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. The store clerk, caught off guard, looked up, his arrogant smirk faltering for the briefest moment before snapping back into place. Keanu Reeves had spoken. He stood there, relaxed yet firm, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his voice, no sharp edge to his words, just a quiet authority that made even the humming refrigerators in the background seem to pause. The question he had posed hung in the air, directed at the clerk, but its weight pressed upon everyone who had been watching in silent complicity. The clerk blinked, taken aback by the unexpected interruption. His instinctive arrogance reasserted itself quickly, though, and he scoffed, rolling his eyes as if dismissing the moment as nothing more than an inconvenience. He crossed his arms over his chest, tilting his head slightly, sizing up the man who had dared to interfere. A challenge lingered in the air, unspoken but clear. Keanu met the gaze without flinching, his posture calm, his expression neutral. But there was something in his eyes, something steady, something unshakable, that made it impossible to ignore him. The store clerk, despite himself, felt an unfamiliar flicker of unease. Another scoff. Another attempt to brush off the moment, to regain the upper hand. The clerk shrugged, muttering something dismissive, something about how it wasn't his fault if people couldn't afford what they picked up. The words, meant to sound indifferent, carried an edge of defiance. Keanu remained unmoved. His reply came without hesitation, without theatrics, yet it landed with the weight of something undeniable. A truth so simple, so fundamental, that it cut through the air like a blade. Kindness doesn't cost anything, but it can change everything. The words settled over the space, lingering longer than any insult, any mockery. A few customers looked up now, some shifting uncomfortably, others lowering their gazes, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their silence had made them complicit. The woman at the counter still hadn't lifted her head. She stood frozen in place, her fingers tightening around the strap of her canvas bag, as if trying to anchor herself in a moment she wasn't sure was real. She wasn't used to kindness, not like this. Not from strangers. Keanu moved then, slow and deliberate. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and, without hesitation, placed enough cash on the counter to cover the woman's groceries, more than enough. The crisp bills rested between him and the clerk, an unspoken expectation hanging in the air. The clerk hesitated. He glanced at the money, then at Keanu, then at the woman. For the first time, the confidence in his smirk faltered, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. Keanu didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The moment stretched, thick with something unnameable, until finally, with an almost reluctant movement, the clerk punched the numbers into the register, the electronic beep cutting through the silence. The transaction was completed. The bag was packed. Keanu turned then, lifting the grocery bag from the counter and gently placing it into the woman's hands. He didn't make a show of it, didn't expect thanks or recognition. Just a simple act, one human being helping another. The woman, still stunned, looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. The words she wanted to say caught in her throat, but she didn't need to speak them. Keanu's warm, reassuring smile was answer enough. And just like that, the moment passed. Keanu turned away, as if it had all been the most natural thing in the world, as if he had only done what anyone should have done. But the room, once indifferent, once a space of quiet cruelty, was different now. And no one watching would forget it. The woman stood frozen, her hands gripping the bag of groceries as though it might disappear if she let go. Her shoulders, which had been hunched in silent defeat just moments before, trembled now with something far more raw, an emotion she couldn't quite name, but one that threatened to spill over. Her lips parted slightly, her breath uneven, as she struggled to find words that wouldn't break beneath the weight of the moment. The store, once filled with idle conversation and the quiet rustling of plastic bags, now held an unnatural stillness. The other customers, many of whom had either ignored or quietly enjoyed the humiliation unfolding earlier, stood in hesitant silence. Some still clutched their baskets, their fingers tightening around handles as though grasping onto their own unease. Others stole glances at one another, as if searching for permission to acknowledge what had just happened. The woman finally found her voice. It was soft, almost hesitant, but there was no mistaking the deep emotion woven into it. She thanked him, but the words carried something heavier, an unease, a quiet resistance. She insisted that she didn't want pity, that she had managed before and would manage again. The weight of struggle was something she had carried for so long that even kindness felt foreign, something to be regarded with caution. Keanu listened, his expression never shifting into anything less than complete understanding. There was no condescension in his gaze, no trace of superiority. He wasn't a savior, he wasn't a hero swooping in to rescue someone who needed rescuing. His kindness wasn't charity, it was something else, something much simpler and yet infinitely greater. This wasn't pity. This was how the world should work. The words, though spoken gently, carried a weight that filled the room. They were not just for the woman standing before him, but for everyone within earshot, for every indifferent face that had turned away, for every smirk that had been exchanged at her expense. The message settled like dust in the air, unavoidable and lingering. Around the store, expressions began to shift. Where there had been amusement, there was now discomfort. Where there had been apathy, there was now a stirring of something that looked dangerously close to reflection. A man near the produce section cleared his throat and looked down, suddenly interested in the expiration date on a carton of milk. A woman who had stood idly scrolling through her phone now slipped it into her pocket, shifting her weight uneasily. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. But it was something close. And then there was the clerk. The confidence that had sat so easily on his features before, the smug tilt of his mouth, the casual arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable, had begun to wane. His smirk had faded, his fingers tapping nervously against the counter as he tried to act as though none of this affected him. He scoffed under his breath, a last-ditch effort to salvage whatever power he thought he had, but there was no real conviction in it. Keanu turned to him then, his eyes steady, his voice even. There was no anger, no confrontation, just an undeniable truth, spoken not as a lesson, but as a simple fact. The way we treat people when no one is watching, that's who we really are. The words cut through whatever remained of the clerk's bravado. His posture stiffened, his face flickering between irritation and something far more vulnerable. It wasn't just a reprimand. It wasn't just a call out. It was a mirror, held up before him, forcing him to see himself exactly as he was. For a moment, he didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The silence stretched, heavier now, filled with the weight of understanding. And then, without another word, Keanu simply turned away. The moment was over. There was nothing else to say. But the lesson would remain. The woman tightened her grip on the grocery bag, the weight of it resting differently in her hands now. It wasn't just food she carried, it was something intangible but powerful, something that settled deep inside her in a way that made her stand just a little straighter. The shame that had threatened to swallow her whole minutes ago had loosened its grip. She hadn't expected this, not the kindness, not the dignity, not the reminder that she was still seen. As she turned toward the exit, her steps felt lighter, her shoulders no longer hunched beneath the invisible burden of judgment. The fluorescent lights above no longer seemed as harsh, the store no longer a place of quiet humiliation. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a space where, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had been treated with simple human decency. The glass door swung open as she stepped outside, and the cool air greeted her like a quiet embrace. She took a breath, deeper than she had in days, maybe weeks, and as she exhaled, something shifted within her. Inside, the store had not yet settled from what had transpired. The air was thick with an energy that hadn't been there before, a kind of awareness that lingered in the silence, in the glances exchanged between strangers who had, moments ago, been nothing more than bystanders. The store clerk, who had stood so smugly behind the counter, now looked different. His posture, once relaxed with an air of effortless superiority, was tense. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, his fingers twitching slightly where they rested on the register. His jaw clenched, his usual arrogance nowhere to be found. He had spent the last few minutes trying to convince himself that it didn't matter, that he didn't care, but something in his expression betrayed him. He cleared his throat. A mumble, barely above a whisper, stumbled out, an apology not quite formed, as if it had been forced from a place of obligation rather than sincerity. It wasn't much, and it came too late, but it was something. A crack in the armor. Someone in line, one of the customers who had watched in silence at first, who had chosen, until now, to be indifferent, spoke up. There was no malice in their voice, no attempt to humiliate, only a simple, undeniable truth. Maybe this was something to learn from. Maybe people weren't as invisible as he had once believed them to be. The words landed where they needed to. The clerk looked down, not meeting anyone's gaze. Keanu Reeves, meanwhile, had already turned to leave. There was no moment of self-congratulation, no pause to soak in the weight of what had just happened. No need for recognition, no expectation of praise. This was never about him. As he walked toward the exit, his steps unhurried, his demeanor as calm as it had been from the start, there was something almost poetic about the way he blended back into the world, as if he had never been there at all. The glass door closed behind him, the bell above jingling softly in his wake. And just like that, he was gone. But what he had left behind, the shift, the lesson, the quiet reminder of what it meant to be good, would remain long after.